Chicago, December 2024. The winds off Lake Michigan cut through the city like a blade, but nothing could have prepared law enforcement for what was brewing in the shadows of the windy city. What started as routine immigration enforcement would explode into one of the most violent confrontations between federal agents and organized crime in modern American history. This isn't just another story about gang violence or drug deals gone wrong. This is the moment when two of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the world decided to make their stand against the United States government. And when the smoke cleared, the streets would run red with consequences that nobody saw coming. The stage was set months before the first shot was fired. Intelligence reports had been flooding into federal agencies for weeks, painting a picture so disturbing that even seasoned agents struggled to believe what they were reading. Hell's Angels chapters from across the Midwest had been quietly mobilizing, their members converging on Chicago like pieces on a chessboard. But they weren't alone. Mexican cartel operatives, hardened killers who had turned entire regions of their homeland into war zones, were moving north across the border with one destination in mind. The alliance that was forming represented something law enforcement had never encountered before, a partnership between American organized crime and international drug cartels that threatened to transform Chicago into a battlefield. The catalyst for this unholy alliance was simple, yet terrifying in its implications. An Immigration Customs Enforcement had launched Operation Steel Curtain, a massive sweep designed to target criminal, undocumented immigrants with records. What was that many didn't realize ICE agents of these targets criminals weren't just random. They were key operatives, intel distribution networks, money laundering operations and enforcement cells that had been carefully embedded in American cities over decades. The cart time, money, and blood to let federal agents dismantle their infrastructure without a fight. And they had invested too much Hell's Angels, who an opportunity to settle saw old scores with willing partners in their most profitable business relationships, protecting law enforcement while mourning when Tuesday. The first signs of trouble came on a bitter ICE agents raid on Chicago's South Side. What it had a warehouse on should have been a routine arrest turned into a nightmare operation when agents found themselves surrounded by heavily armed bikers wearing the colors of multiple Hell's Angels chapters. The warehouse wasn't just storing drugs or housing undocumented workers. It was a command center, complete with encrypted communications equipment, military-grade weapons, and detailed intelligence files on federal law enforcement operations. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just criminal enterprise anymore. It was organized resistance against the federal government. Federal intelligence analysts worked around the clock to piece together what they were facing. The partnership between Hell's Angels and cartel operatives hadn't happened overnight. It was the culmination of years of careful relationship building, mutual respect, and shared profits that had created bonds stronger than blood. Both organizations understood violence, respected strength, and operated under codes of loyalty that made them natural allies against a common enemy. When ICE threatened to disrupt their carefully constructed networks, they responded the only way they knew how. With overwhelming force and absolute brutality, the cartels brought resources that even the Hell's Angels found impressive. Military-trained sicarios who had learned urban warfare in the streets of Juarez and Tijuana. Weapons smuggled from conflicts around the world that made American gang arsenals look like toy collections. Most importantly, they brought a level of tactical sophistication that transformed what could have been random violence into coordinated military operations. These weren't street gangs fighting over corners anymore. These were experienced warriors who had battled Mexican military forces and lived to tell about it. The Hell's Angels' contribution was equally valuable but different in nature. They provided something the cartels desperately needed in American cities: local knowledge, established networks, and the kind of institutional memory that comes from decades of operating in specific territories. Hell's Angels chapters knew every police patrol route, every federal surveillance technique, and every weakness in law enforcement operations. They had contacts in trucking companies, construction firms, and legitimate businesses that could provide cover for cartel operations. Most importantly, they had the respect and fear that came with being America's most notorious outlaw motorcycle club. Chicago police commanders found themselves dealing with a situation that their training had never prepared them for. Gang units that specialized in local conflicts were suddenly facing international criminals with military experience. Narcotics detectives accustomed to investigating traditional drug operations discovered networks that spanned continents and generated revenues that exceeded the budgets of small nations. The violence that erupted wasn't random street crime. It was strategic, calculated, and designed to send a message that would echo through every federal building in the country. The first major clash came when ICE agents attempted to serve warrants at a motorcycle repair shop that intelligence had identified as a Hells Angels front operation. What agents expected to find was evidence of drug trafficking or illegal weapons. What they discovered was a war room where bikers and cartel operatives had been planning coordinated attacks on federal facilities. Maps with locations of IC covered every wall, marked e-offices, federal courthouses, and detention centers. Communication logs revealed a level of coordination between criminal organizations that law enforcement had never imagined possible. The response was swift and terrifying. Within hours of the raid, coordinated attacks began across the city. ICE vehicles were ambushed by heavily armed teams that struck with military precision and disappeared before backup could arrive. Federal agents found their homes under surveillance by men who knew their daily routines better than their own families did. The message was clear and unmistakable. The criminals weren't just defending themselves anymore. They were taking the fight directly to the government agents who threatened their operations. Emergency meetings at the highest levels of federal law enforcement painted a picture that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Chicago was becoming a war zone, and traditional policing methods were proving inadequate against an enemy that combined the ruthlessness of Mexican cartels with the local knowledge of American organized crime. The partnership had created something new and dangerous, a hybrid criminal organization that operated like an insurgency while maintaining the profit-driven focus of traditional organized crime. Intelligence reports revealed the true scope of what law enforcement was facing. The alliance wasn't limited to Chicago. Similar partnerships were forming in cities across the country, creating a network of criminal resistance that threatened to overwhelm federal immigration enforcement. Los Angeles, Phoenix, Detroit, and Houston were all reporting similar patterns of coordination between outlaw motorcycle clubs and cartel operatives. What had started as a local law enforcement problem was rapidly becoming a national security crisis. The cartels had learned valuable lessons from their conflicts with Mexican military forces. They understood that conventional confrontation with government forces was a losing strategy in the long term. But they also knew that sustained harassment, targeted violence, and psychological warfare could make law enforcement operations so costly and dangerous that politicians would be forced to reconsider their priorities. The Hells Angels provided the perfect local partners for this strategy, bringing their own grievances against federal law enforcement and their willingness to use violence to protect their interests. Federal authorities realized they were facing an unprecedented threat that required an unprecedented response. Traditional law enforcement agencies, designed to investigate crimes and arrest criminals, were not equipped to handle what was essentially an insurgency operating within American borders. The decision was made at the highest levels of government. If criminal organizations wanted to wage war against the federal government, then war was exactly what they would get. The call went out through channels that most Americans didn't even know existed. Deep within the Pentagon, classified communications networks began buzzing with activity as military commanders received orders that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The situation in Chicago had escalated beyond the capabilities of traditional law enforcement. Federal authorities needed a response that matched the military-level threat they were facing. And when the United States military decides to solve a problem, they don't send parking tickets. Marine Corps Force reconnaissance units stationed at Camp Pendleton received deployment orders with unprecedented speed. These weren't ordinary Marines. Force recon operators represented the elite of the elite, warriors who had cut their teeth in the mountains of Afghanistan and the urban battlegrounds of Iraq. Men who understood violence as a language and spoke it fluently. When politicians needed problems eliminated quickly and permanently, these were the soldiers they called. The mission briefing was unlike anything these battle-hardened veterans had encountered on American soil. The intelligence package painted a picture that would have been dismissed as fiction if it hadn't been verified by multiple federal agencies. Criminal organizations had effectively declared war on the federal government, using tactics and weapons that rivaled anything these Marines had faced in overseas combat zones. The enemy wasn't wearing uniforms or following the rules of war. They were hiding among civilians, using women and children as shields, and employing guerrilla tactics that made conventional law enforcement response impossible. This wasn't a police action anymore. It was urban warfare on American streets. Military planners worked through the night to develop response strategies that would neutralize the threat while minimizing civilian casualties. The challenge was enormous. How do you deploy military force against criminal organizations operating in populated areas without turning American cities into war zones? The answer came from hard-won experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, where similar challenges had been met with tactical innovations that revolutionized urban combat. These Marines had learned to fight in cities where every building could hide an enemy sniper and every street corner could conceal an improvised explosive device. The deployment began under cover of darkness. Military transport aircraft landed at air bases around Chicago, disgorging teams of heavily armed Marines who moved with the precision of surgical instruments. These weren't the parade ground soldiers that civilians saw in recruiting commercials. These were killers, trained to eliminate threats with maximum efficiency and minimum hesitation. Their equipment reflected their mission: night vision systems that turned darkness into daylight, communications gear that allowed instant coordination across multiple teams, and weapons systems designed for close-quarters urban combat. Intelligence networks that had been tracking Cartel and Hell's Angels movements suddenly found themselves supported by military surveillance assets that made their previous capabilities look primitive. Satellite imagery that could read license plates from orbit, electronic warfare systems that could intercept encrypted communications, and reconnaissance drones that could track targets for days without detection. The criminals who had felt secure in their coordination and planning suddenly discovered that their every move was being monitored by assets they didn't even know existed. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Hell's Angels members, who had spent decades intimidating law enforcement officers, suddenly found themselves being watched by men who had killed professional soldiers in foreign wars. Cartel operatives, who were accustomed to being the most dangerous people in any room, discovered that their reputation meant nothing to Marines who had eliminated enemies in some of the world's most dangerous combat zones. The predators had suddenly become prey, and they knew it. Military doctrine emphasizes the importance of seizing initiative and maintaining momentum once operations begin. The Marine response followed these principles with terrifying efficiency. Rather than reacting to criminal attacks, the Marines began hunting their enemies with systematic precision that left no room for escape or negotiation. Teams moved through Chicago neighborhoods like ghosts, using advanced technology and superior training to track down targets who had thought themselves untouchable. The first major engagement came when Marines surrounded a warehouse that intelligence had identified as a major weapons storage facility. Unlike the ICE agents who had been ambushed days earlier, these Marines approached their target with overwhelming force and tactical superiority that eliminated any possibility of effective resistance. When the criminals inside realized they were facing military professionals rather than federal agents, their bravado evaporated faster than morning mist. The precision and speed of the assault left no time for the kind of coordinated resistance that had proven so effective against traditional law enforcement. Criminal communications networks that had operated with confidence for months suddenly went silent as their operators realized that their encrypted channels were being monitored by military intelligence assets. The sophisticated surveillance systems that Cartels and Hell's Angels had developed to track law enforcement movements proved useless against military units that employed countermeasures developed for warfare against peer adversaries. Every advantage that the criminals had carefully cultivated was neutralized by superior training, better equipment, and tactical experience gained in the world's most dangerous combat zones. The speed with which the situation changed caught criminal leadership completely off guard. Hell's Angels, chapter presidents who had been planning coordinated attacks, found themselves unable to communicate with their members. Cartel cell leaders, who had been coordinating operations across multiple cities, discovered that their networks had been penetrated by intelligence assets they never knew existed. The alliance that had seemed so powerful just days earlier began to fragment as individual survival became more important than collective resistance. Marine Corps doctrine emphasizes the importance of destroying enemy command and control capabilities as quickly as possible. The criminal networks that had taken years to develop were systematically dismantled in hours through targeted operations that eliminated key leadership figures and communication nodes. The decentralized structure that had made these organizations so resilient against traditional law enforcement became a liability when facing military professionals who understood how to exploit such weaknesses. Federal prosecutors who had been struggling to build cases against sophisticated criminal networks suddenly found themselves with evidence that would have taken years to gather through conventional investigation. Military intelligence assets provided detailed records of criminal communications, financial transactions, and operational planning that painted a complete picture of the conspiracy. The legal framework that protected American citizens from government overreach proved inadequate when dealing with organizations that had declared war on the federal government itself. The psychological warfare component of the military response proved as effective as the kinetic operations. Criminal organizations that thrived on intimidation and fear suddenly found themselves outmatched by professionals who understood violence at a level that made gang intimidation look like playground bullying. The reputation for ruthlessness that had made Cartels and Hell's Angels so feared in their respective territories meant nothing to Marines who had faced enemies armed with military weapons and trained in professional military tactics. Within 72 hours of military deployment, the criminal alliance that had seemed so formidable began to collapse under pressure, that it had never been designed to withstand. The urban warfare tactics that had proven so effective against Mexican military forces proved inadequate against American Marines who had refined their skills in the most dangerous combat zones on Earth. The partnership between Hells Angels and cartels, built on mutual respect for violence and shared hatred of law enforcement, crumbled when faced with opponents who understood both violence and warfare at a professional level that neither criminal organization could match. The collapse wasn't gradual. It was sudden, violent, and absolute. Criminal networks that had taken decades to build disintegrated in mere hours as Marine units moved through Chicago with surgical precision. The warehouse raids that followed revealed the true scope of what law enforcement had been facing. Weapons caches that contained military-grade equipment smuggled from conflict zones around the world. Communication centers equipped with technology that rivaled government facilities. Most disturbing of all, detailed plans for attacks on federal buildings that would have made the Oklahoma City bombing look like a firecracker. Hells Angels members who had built their reputations on intimidation and violence found themselves completely outclassed by opponents who had learned their trade in places where violence was an art form. The leather jackets and motorcycle colors that had struck fear into the hearts of rival gangs meant nothing to Marines who had eliminated professional insurgents in urban environments far more dangerous than any American city. When bikers tried to use their traditional tactics of overwhelming numbers and brutal intimidation, they discovered that their opponents had faced similar challenges in Iraq and Afghanistan, and had developed countermeasures that turned their strengths into weaknesses. The psychological impact on cartel operatives was equally devastating. These men had earned their reputations in the blood-soaked streets of Mexico, where they had battled military forces and emerged victorious. But the American Marines they now faced operated at a level of professional competence that made their previous enemies look like amateurs. The tactical sophistication, advanced technology, and ruthless efficiency of the Marine response left hardened sicarios questioning everything they thought they knew about warfare. Communication intercepts revealed the panic spreading through criminal ranks as leaders realized they were facing an enemy they couldn't intimidate, corrupt, or outfight. Encrypted messages between cartel cells spoke of unprecedented losses and tactical failures that defied explanation. Hells Angels chapter communications showed similar patterns of confusion and fear as members struggled to understand how their carefully planned operations had been anticipated and neutralized with such devastating effectiveness. The financial networks that had funded this criminal alliance began to unravel as military intelligence assets traced money flows with precision that made traditional financial investigations look primitive. Cryptocurrency wallets that criminals had thought were anonymous were tracked and seized. Shell companies that had laundered millions in drug profits found their assets frozen by federal authorities armed with evidence gathered through military surveillance operations. The economic foundation that had made the Hells Angels cartel partnership so powerful crumbled as quickly as their operational capabilities. Marine units didn't just eliminate criminal operations, they systematically destroyed the infrastructure that had made such operations possible. Safe houses were raided and demolished, communication networks were infiltrated and shut down, transportation routes were identified and blocked. The methodical destruction of criminal capabilities followed military doctrine that emphasized preventing enemy reconstitution rather than simply defeating current threats. Intelligence analysis revealed the full extent of how close America had come to facing a genuine insurgency on its own soil. The partnership between Hells Angels and cartels hadn't been limited to Chicago. Similar alliances were forming in cities across the country, creating a network of criminal resistance that could have paralyzed federal law enforcement operations nationwide. The swift military response in Chicago served as both solution and warning to criminal organizations considering similar partnerships. Federal prosecutors found themselves with evidence that painted a picture of conspiracy so vast that it challenged traditional concepts of organized crime. The alliance between American outlaw motorcycle clubs and Mexican drug cartels represented something entirely new in criminal evolution. Not just cooperation between criminal organizations, but the formation of hybrid entities that combined the best capabilities of both partners while minimizing their individual weaknesses. The legal ramifications extended far beyond the individuals arrested in Chicago. The precedent of using military force against criminal organizations operating within American borders raised constitutional questions that would be debated for years. Civil liberties advocates argued that the deployment violated fundamental principles of American law enforcement. National security experts countered that the threat posed by militarized criminal organizations required responses that traditional law enforcement simply couldn't provide. Military after-action reports analyzed the effectiveness of urban combat tactics when applied to law enforcement situations. The lessons learned in Chicago would influence military doctrine for years to come, providing valuable insights insights into how conventional military forces could be employed against unconventional threats operating in civilian environments. The successful neutralization of the Hells Angels cartel alliance became a case study in how military precision could solve problems that had proven intractable for traditional law enforcement. The speed and effectiveness of the military response sent shockwaves through criminal organizations across North America. Hells Angels chapters that had been considering similar alliances with cartel partners suddenly reconsidered their plans. Mexican drug trafficking organizations began reassessing the risks of operating on American soil when such operations could trigger military responses. The psychological deterrent effect proved as important as the immediate tactical success in Chicago. Criminal intelligence networks that had been monitoring law enforcement capabilities found themselves completely blind to military assets and capabilities. The surveillance systems that cartels and Hells Angels had developed to track police movements proved useless against military units that employed operational security measures developed for warfare against peer adversaries. The information advantage that had made criminal organizations so successful against traditional law enforcement evaporated when they faced opponents who understood intelligence warfare at a professional level. The aftermath revealed just how sophisticated the criminal alliance had become before military intervention. Evidence seized during operations showed that Hells Angels and cartel operatives had been sharing tactical knowledge, cross-training personnel, and developing hybrid operational methods that combined the best practices of both organizations. American bikers had been learning urban warfare tactics from battle-tested sicarios, while cartel operatives had been gaining insight into American law enforcement methods and legal systems from their Hells Angels partners. Marine Corps leadership emphasized that the Chicago operation represented a new model for addressing threats that fell between traditional law enforcement and conventional military operations. The hybrid nature of modern criminal organizations required hybrid responses that combined the legal authority of law enforcement with the tactical capabilities of military units. The success in Chicago validated concepts that military planners had been developing for years, but had never had the opportunity to test in real-world operations. The technological aspects of the operation revealed how military surveillance and intelligence capabilities could revolutionize law enforcement operations when properly applied. Satellite imagery that could track individual vehicles across multiple states, electronic warfare systems that could intercept and decode encrypted communications, and reconnaissance drones that could maintain surveillance for weeks without detection. These capabilities, developed for military operations overseas, proved equally effective against criminal organizations operating on American soil. Federal agencies began incorporating lessons learned from the Chicago operation into their standard procedures for dealing with sophisticated criminal organizations. The recognition that some threats required military-level responses led to the development of new protocols for requesting military support and new legal frameworks for authorizing such operations. The boundary between law enforcement and military operations, once considered sacred in American jurisprudence, began to blur as the nature of criminal threats evolved. The international implications of the Chicago operation extended far beyond American borders. Mexican government officials, who had been struggling with cartel violence for decades, watched with intense interest as American military forces demonstrated capabilities that could potentially be applied to their own security challenges. The tactical lessons learned from urban combat against hybrid criminal military organizations proved applicable to conflicts around the world where similar threats were emerging. Criminal organizations that had survived the Chicago operation found themselves operating in a fundamentally changed environment. The old rules of engagement between criminals and law enforcement no longer applied when military units could be deployed against threats that exceeded traditional law enforcement capabilities. The psychological impact of knowing that criminal activities could trigger military responses changed the risk calculations that had governed organized crime operations for decades. The documentation captured during Chicago operations provided unprecedented insight into how modern criminal organizations operated across international boundaries. Financial records showed money flows that connected street-level drug operations in American cities to cartel leadership in Mexican strongholds. Communication logs revealed coordination between criminal cells that spanned multiple countries and operated with the precision of military units. The intelligence value of this information would influence law enforcement and national security operations for years to come. As news of the Chicago operation spread through criminal networks, the psychological deterrent effect began to manifest in ways that law enforcement had never anticipated. Criminal organizations that had been planning similar operations suddenly found their members reconsidering their involvement. The prospect of facing military rather than law enforcement opposition fundamentally changed the risk-reward calculations that governed criminal decision-making. What had once seemed like profitable criminal enterprises now appeared to be potential suicide missions. The ripple effects of Chicago reached criminal boardrooms from Montreal to Guadalajara within hours. Encrypted communications between cartel leadership and Hell's Angels hierarchy painted a picture of organizations scrambling to reassess their entire operational framework. What had seemed like an unstoppable alliance just days earlier was now being questioned at the highest levels of both criminal enterprises. The mathematical reality was brutal and undeniable. When criminals went to war with the federal government and lost this badly, there were only two choices left: surrender or escalate. Mexican cartel leadership held emergency meetings in fortified compounds across Sinaloa and Jalisco states. These weren't street-level dealers panicking over lost profits. These were criminal CEOs who controlled billions in revenue and commanded armies of sicarios. The intelligence reports filtering back from Chicago described military operations that exceeded anything they had faced during their conflicts with Mexican federal forces. The Americans hadn't just won a battle, they had demonstrated capabilities that fundamentally altered the strategic landscape of North American organized crime. Cartel intelligence networks that had successfully penetrated law enforcement agencies for decades found themselves completely blind to military planning and operations. The sources that had provided advance warning of police raids and federal investigations proved useless when dealing with military units that employed operational security measures developed for warfare against foreign adversaries. For criminal organizations that had built their success on information superiority, this intelligence blackout represented an existential threat to their survival. Hell's Angels chapters across North America received coded messages that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. National leadership was ordering the immediate suspension of all operations involving cartel partners. Weapons caches were to be relocated or destroyed. Safe houses were to be abandoned. Communication networks were to be shut down. The organization that had built its reputation on never backing down from a fight was essentially ordering a full retreat from the most profitable criminal alliance in its history. The economic implications rippled through criminal networks like shockwaves from an earthquake. Drug distribution routes that had generated millions in monthly revenue were suddenly abandoned as too dangerous to operate. Money laundering operations that had processed cartel profits for years were shut down overnight. Legitimate businesses that had served as fronts for criminal activities found themselves severing ties with partners they had worked with for decades. The financial foundation of the Hells Angels cartel alliance was crumbling faster than anyone possible. Federal had thought prosecutors found themselves dealing with a flood of cooperation offers from criminals who had previously considered themselves untouchable. Hells Angels members who had spent decades building reputations for absolute loyalty suddenly found themselves calculating whether their brotherhood was worth facing military opposition. Cartel operatives who had survived wars against Mexican military forces decided that discretion was the better part of valor when facing American Marines who had proven their tactical superiority so decisively. The psychological warfare component of the Chicago operation continued to pay dividends weeks after the last shots were fired. Criminal organizations across the country reported unprecedented levels of paranoia and internal suspicion as members questioned whether their communications were being monitored by military intelligence assets. The secure communication networks that had enabled sophisticated criminal coordination for years became sources of anxiety rather than confidence, as criminals realized they had no idea what capabilities their opponents possessed. Intelligence analysts studying intercepted communications discovered that the Chicago operation had triggered a fundamental restructuring of how American criminal organizations approach operations. Mexican cartels that had been expanding their presence in American cities suddenly began withdrawing personnel and assets back across the border. Hells Angels chapters that had been planning territorial expansions instead found themselves consolidating operations and reducing their profiles. The offensive posture that had characterized both organizations was replaced by defensive thinking that prioritized survival over profit. Military planners conducting after-action analysis identified tactical innovations that would influence urban warfare doctrine for years to come. The integration of military surveillance assets with law enforcement intelligence networks had created information dominance that made criminal countermeasures virtually impossible. The speed and precision of military responses had eliminated the time advantages that criminal organizations had traditionally exploited to escape law enforcement pressure. Most importantly, The psychological impact had proven as devastating as the kinetic operations themselves. The streets of Chicago fell silent as the last marine transport disappeared into the winter sky, leaving behind a city forever changed by 72 hours of urban warfare that redefined the relationship between American law enforcement and organized crime. The alliance that had promised to bring the federal government to its knees lay in ruins, scattered across warehouse floors and detention centers from the south side to the suburbs. But this wasn't just another victory in the endless war on drugs. This was a declaration that when criminal organizations chose to wage war against the United States government, they would face the full might of American military power with all the precision and lethality that entailed. The message echoed through criminal networks from coast to coast, and the reverberations would be felt for generations to come.